Hello, everyone. This is Jenny Parks from MEC. I am your host today, and we aren't quite ready to start, but we thought we would go live a few minutes early to make sure that everyone is feeling comfortable with his or her audio and visual, and if you had any other questions. So please, this is a good time to type in that chat box and ask me any questions you have, and we will get them sorted out. And I see some folks I know, and some folks I know by stellar reputation. So looks like a good crowd today. So I don't know where all of you are located as you are listening in. We are in not quite sunny Minneapolis and Wisconsin, where things are very snowy. All right, looks like we've got a few questions. Audio visual seems fine. Great. Audio's great. Good. Thank you for that feedback, Jared. For those of you who are new to GoToMeeting, I know we are at MEC. This is one of our earliest endeavors with it. We do have an attached handout. You can see that among some of your options here in your little control panel. And I show it's 12:57 p.m. Central Time, so we will start everything in about 3 minutes. But once again, if you've just joined recently, please let us know. Use the chat box to tell us if you are having any issues with audio or visual. All right, this is still Jenny, just asking if anyone else has any questions. Hoping you all are having a good day. We will start the webinar in about 2 minutes. This is Jenny Parks, your host, and we're almost ready to get started. Once again, if you've got any questions about this GoToMeeting platform, which is new for all of us, just let us know. Use the chat box, please. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. This webinar is, yes, there is a framework for non-degree credentials. It's brought to you by the Multi-State Collaborative on Military Credit. Today is Tuesday, February 11th, 2020. I will just remind you here at the beginning of the webinar that a recording of the webinar will be sent when we're finished today. And if you do have questions during the webinar, please use the chat box that's in the control panel at the right-hand side of your screen. And then finally, when you are finished and you receive some communication from us at the end, when we send that recording, there will be a survey. We ask that you kindly submit that too, so that we know how to continue providing webinars that are of optimal assistance and interest to you. All right, so let's get started. I am Jenny Parks. Oops, as I had said, I am your moderator today. I'm the Senior Director for Policy and Academic Initiatives at MEC, and I'm not usually the MCMC host. As you all know, that is usually Sarah Appel, who is the MEC Multi-State Collaborative on Military Credit Manager. But she is in high demand right now doing her spring tour of various military connected meetings. And so I have stepped in today to try to fill her very large and impressive shoes. As always, we want to thank some of our sponsors. Those of you who've worked with MCMC for a while know that a lot of the initial funding came from the Lumina Foundation and from the Strata Education Network. And once again, I will remind you to go ahead and submit your questions via the chat box. We have a number of staff here able to work on those and respond to you. So let me provide an overview for those of you who are not familiar with MCMC. The mission of the Multi-State Collaborative on Military Credit is to facilitate an interstate partnership of 13 states and to translate competencies acquired by veterans through military training and experiences toward college credentials. States exchange information and share best practices in the areas of articulation of credit, certification and licensure, communication, and data technology. The goals for the MCMC project are these. First, we want to assist states and post-secondary institutions in aiding military-connected students with critical life transitions from the military to post-secondary education, and then from post-secondary education to civilian employment. Goal number 2, increase post-secondary education completion rates by creating models for the consistent, transparent, and effective awarding of credit from military training and experience that can be scaled regionally and nationally, thereby lowering the cost of education and reducing the time to completion. And then finally, our third goal, establish a strong network of support, communication, documentation, and data collection among institutions and organizations for the purpose of promoting shared interests and tracking the efficacy of efforts to enhance military-connected students' educational success. So with that as our background, it's important for you to know also that we work in 4 different areas with knowledge communities: the articulation of academic credit community, communication and outreach, data, systems and technology, and licensure and certification. Today's presenter is Michelle Van Noy. She is the Associate Director of Education and Employment Research Center and the Assistant Research Professor at Rutgers Education and Employment Research Center. That is a very long title, Michelle. You must get some kind of a record. So I am going to turn this over to Michelle so that she can tell us that, yes, there is a framework for non-degree credentials. Thanks, Michelle.
Okay, thank you so much today for inviting me to share with you the work that I've been doing and others here at the Education and Employment Research Center at Rutgers. You know, we've been working on this project funded generously by the Lumina Foundation as well, to think a little bit more about non-degree credentials and how we can understand their quality and how to assess it. So I guess before we get started, I know that we sort of put together a quick poll maybe to kind of gather some interest on some of the various things we'll talk about today. So maybe now is a good time to get everyone to weigh in on the poll. We can put that up.
Sorry about that here in the background. I just accidentally double-clicked and it closed it.
That's okay. I can spend a moment. I was going to tell you all a little bit about our research center. We're at Rutgers, and our center, as the name implies, deals with the connection between education and employment. We have a wide range of research spanning from credential quality in the non-degree credential area to community college workforce programs to decision making that students encounter around careers and majors. So we've done work around prior learning assessment and a wide variety of things. So this particular topic is something that's near and dear to our heart, but we have a lot of other areas of interest as well. So I think later on the presentation I have our website, so if anyone's interested in checking out further our work, it's available. But definitely looking forward to sharing with you the findings from this work.
So this is Jenny. It looks like we're having some technical issues with the poll.
Okay. All right.
So what I
move
can
ahead.
do is, why don't I run through some of those? At least folks can begin to use it as a way to think about how to frame their thoughts. So what we were asking in the poll is, which areas would you like to learn more about through today's presentation? And your options were how the credential is designed and awarded, the competencies the credential holder. Let me make sure I've got my good options here. Well, you know what, Michelle, you might be able to read them better than I am.
Sure. Okay. So the four topic areas, just to get a pulse on where everyone's interests are, would be first thinking about how credentials are designed and awarded. The second area is thinking about the competencies that credential holders possess. The third one would be to think about how credentials come to have value. And the final one is looking at how the outcomes to credential holders, employers, and society. So those are the four sort of topic areas. And I guess the question is thinking about those four areas, which is of most interest?
Thank you, Michelle. That's a good way to help people frame their thoughts and anticipate what you've got to share with us.
Okay. All right. Should I move forward then?
Yeah, let's go ahead and move forward.
Okay. All right. Very good. So those are just some big questions. So I guess just to give some context to what I'm talking about today, we're talking about non-degree credentials. In a moment, I'll get into describing a little bit more what non-degree credentials are. But we know that, it's a big, broad grouping of different things here. And what we see is that a lot of this is coming up because of the sort of rapid changes in our labor market, contributing to an increased need to promote lifelong learning and just-in-time training for people to keep up with changes in the economy, career changes and things like that. And what this has all led to is a vast proliferation of different types of non-degree credentials. These have been around for some time, but we've seen a massive, massive increase in numbers and types of non-degree credentials. So recent data, we've started to see some new data coming out of the U.S. Department of Education. A recent survey coming out of NCES shows that a total of 27% of adults, over a quarter of adults, report having some type of non-degree credential, which according to this survey could include a post-secondary certificate, a certification, or license. So this is getting to be a pretty big number of our population. So let me see. Why is my slide not advancing?
Michelle, I can try to do that for you. Let's see if I can
go to the next one. I don't know why it's not moving. Worked up until now.
Yeah, there we go. Is that it?
Yes, that's it. Okay,
all right, great.
So this is the types and definitions of non-degree credentials I mentioned. This might be small. Hope everyone can see it. So when we did our work here, and the work that we were really tasked to do was to try and really map out a sense of how you could measure quality for non-degree credentials. And so we wanted to take an expansive view of what is included in non-degree credentials. And so I think a very broad view of what's included includes some of a group of credit certificates, so things that are offered at the sub-baccalaureate level, certificates that are awarded by educational institutions for completing short and long-term, considered a long-term certificates, but usually less than 1 year in length. Where we see a lot of recent activities in the area of non-credit certificates. So these are also awarded by educational institutions, sometimes also by employers, for the completion of an educational program that does not lead to academic credit. We also included apprenticeships in this category of non-degree credentials, and then industry certifications. So these are credentials that are awarded by an industry body or a governmental agency, and oftentimes they're intended to demonstrate a particular kind of skill that can be done by examination, either by performance or by a test. But it's typically, the essential idea here is that it's based on an industry or an occupational standard. Similarly, there's also occupational or professional licensure, and these are credentials awarded by a government agency, also for demonstration of skill, but it's particular to a specific occupation. Sometimes it can be also tied to completing an educational program, and many times these are required for a person to work in an occupation required by law. And then the final category that I think is very emerging and very new and not well understood is the category of badges and micro-credentials. And so these are credentials awarded for the completion of typically a short-term program of study or demonstration of a very targeted set of skills. And I think, this is, again, as I said, it's an area that's still very much emerging, and we're trying to define what that means. So what do we know about non-degree credentials? I think like I said, there's such a variety of things going on here. We know that they're offered by a wide range of organizations. Some of them are educational institutions, but we also have industry groups and government and unions, a wide range of organizations. There's variety in terms of what they're awarded for. So whether it's for completing a course or completing work experience or demonstrating a particular competency through an examination, there's a different set of criteria depending on the credential. These can be for learning that occurs in many locales. So it's not just for learning that occurs at school. It can be for learning at work or informally, even on one's own through self-study or other ways. And I think one challenge we've certainly seen as researchers, and I think for anybody trying to get a sense of what's going on with non-degree credentials, is really that they're so limited. The data is very limited, and the data that's available is in a lot of different sources, whether some states collect this data, but not comprehensively. Industry has some of this data, and national surveys are beginning to collect it, but the data is really very fragmented at this point. So what we see about non-degree credentials is that, kind of taking a look at what's going on with them, it's really kind of like the Wild West. So understanding the quality is very difficult. We're having a hard time even understanding what they are, let alone how to assess quality. There's no single system or set of standards or mechanisms that really help us define quality or measure it. And there certainly is a lot of variation beyond even just the kinds of credentials. There's variation by geography of where somebody lives and works, and there's also variation by industry and by individual. So there's really a lot going on here, and a lot of opportunity to make sense of these and really try and build some standards, because it is the Wild West. And I guess there's something nice about the freedom and the openness, but there's also a danger that people will invest their time and money in credentials that are not worthwhile, and will be going down the road of chasing a false promise. And so I think that's really where this discussion around quality is really important for individuals, for employers, for society as a whole, to help us eliminate some of the confusion that exists in this area. So what is quality? I think we have to really step back and ask this question. I think when we began this project, we were really realized the need to sort of step back and try and map out what is quality, given that there's so little data. Not that we have a lot of data that we can go to. So we kind of took the opposite approach, which was to say, if we had data, what would we measure? What would we want to look at? And we realized there's a lot of different things at stake here. And part of it is that we need to think about whose perspective are we looking at when we think about defining quality. Is it the credential holder? Is it the employer? Is it the educational institution or other institution that's offering it? Is it the policymaker? And in some cases, there can be potential tensions in those goals. And so it's important to think about whose perspective are we talking about when we're talking about quality. And in particular, that's important because we want to make sure that that non-degree credentials are ensuring equity, that they are not perpetuating inequalities, that they're not tracking people down roads and paths that may not be valuable to them, that may not lead to further advancement. And so I think that's really why the discussion of quality is so important, and it's so important to think about the different perspectives involved. And so what we ended up coming up with, and what I want to share with you today, is a conceptual framework that can be a guide and even a diagnostic tool when thinking about quality in non-degree credentials. So the key elements of non-degree credential quality, kind of alluding to those four categories that we began with the presentation with, is the first one is credential design. So that is really looking at how the credential itself is set up. So what does the credential represent in terms of the competencies it marks, and how does it seek to do that? And I'll talk about each of these four elements in more detail as we go through, but I want to give you the overview here first. So in addition to credential design, there are competencies, and these are the skills and the knowledge that the credential aims to represent in the people who hold it. There's another group of elements that we call market processes, and these are really different processes that are at work that help us understand how a credential comes to be recognized and have value, have currency. We often don't pay attention or explicitly discuss these processes, but they are important, particularly for non-degree credentials, which are in many cases new and emerging and don't have established meanings of recognition associated with them. The final category that we think about are outcomes, and so these are really, you know, the wide range of outcomes of value in terms of education and employment and social advantage. Advancement that can come to individuals, employers, and society. So I'll talk more about each of those. Here's a quick visual that I will spend time walking through each of these boxes, but these refer to the four different elements I talked about. And if you care to later read up a little bit more on what we've written, you'll see this model in our full report and executive summary that's available that discusses this quality framework. So we have some suggestions on how the framework might be used. I think certainly the elements can be used as a guide when thinking about how to conceptualize and how to measure quality. So if you're thinking about how do I even approach this, you can look at those as sort of almost like a menu of options. And I realize that given the different kinds of non-degree credentials, there's potentially some variation in how important each of these elements are for a particular non-degree credential. So this is sort of intended to be a comprehensive guide that then can be used to focus in on areas that may be more or less important, because we do have a lot of different elements that we suggest. We also think that this can be used as a diagnostic tool. So if you find that you know, one particular area of a non-degree credential is not working well, you find that employment outcomes aren't really where you thought they might be, you can work back through the framework to see what might be some of the other factors that could be leading to that. Is it that the competencies aren't properly designed at the beginning, or is it that employers don't know about it and don't recognize it? So we can talk more about that later. And again, thinking about the different goals of who this is relevant for. And throughout this, we want to keep emphasizing the importance of equity in thinking about the different elements of quality. And also recognize that some of these are very different from place to place. So I know people are maybe wanting to put in questions, and feel free to do that if some of this is not making sense as I'm going through, or if clarifications. I'll try not to rush too fast through this. There is a lot of content. So let me start by talking a little bit about credential design and some of the elements that are involved in credential design. So one important element of credential design is the relevance of the competencies that are in the credential. That the credential seeks to represent. So this is thinking about the upfront design phase of creating a credential. How are those competencies decided upon? Is industry involved in creating the curriculum or examinations? Are there ongoing processes to make sure that these competencies stay updated? Is labor market data used? Are there other external entities that review the curriculum to ensure that it's aligned with occupational standards? And are educators, educational institutions involved to think about the curriculum and assure alignment with educational pathways? So what were the processes for coming up with the competencies that the credential is based on? In addition to sort of the basis for the content in the credential, we also view the instructional processes that are used in conveying information for the credential. Are they appropriate to the needs of all students? And this is the case for non-degree credentials where there is classroom-based instruction. We also recognize that there are some non-degree credentials where there might not be classroom-based instruction automatically tied with the credential, like many industry certifications, for example, where somebody could study on their own and take an exam later. So that's what I said, that some of these categories may be more or less relevant depending on the kind of credential we're talking about. But where there is instruction, it's important to take a look at those processes and make sure that they're relevant and they're up to date. Assessment is a very important part of credential design. So thinking about the initial assessment of competencies, does it measure what it's intended to measure? Does passing the examination actually ensure that those competencies are represented in the individual? Are those assessments fair to all students and to diverse learners? And in the case where there are ongoing assessments, think about whether the continuing education or ongoing renewal processes are appropriate and exist where it makes sense. So I think there's a lot that can be learned about assessment of non-degree credentials that we really know very little about right now, but it's an important area to begin to build some processes around. Stackability and portability is something that gets a lot of attention and is very important when thinking about non-degree credentials. In many cases, they're considered sort of entry-level points for career pathways, and so it's important to think about whether a non-degree credential is designed so that it can be stacked with other credentials along a pathway to lead to further education and employment. And so really thinking about whether it's accepted by employers and how central that was to its initial design. Transparency across the board with credentials is very important, that there's information on the competencies that's available through the credential, and that information is clearly communicated to credential seekers, employers, and other stakeholders. So it's not only information on the competencies, but also how the competencies are assessed. So really having a lot of information available about the credential is an important piece of the design. Finally, accessibility and affordability is a very important piece of thinking about non-degree credentials. Is there financial support available? And this is certainly a big area for discussion with relevance to the debates around short-term Pell, for example, but certainly also within states about whether or not to make public money available to support non-degree credentials. And so, thinking about what the implications are for this in terms of students who may be trying to get access to initial career pathways through non-degree credentials. In addition to the financial aspects, it's also important to think about other ways that non-degree credentials may or may not be accessible to students, including through scheduling that makes sense and the availability of support services, which in many cases are not available to students who are pursuing non-degree credentials, particularly in non-credit programs where they may be getting less support or advising. And also thinking about how outreach and location functions with non-degree credentials. Is it open to a diverse group of learners? And are the enrollment criteria relevant and appropriate and also accessible to a broad group of students? So those are the elements of credential design that are important. The next really important area of thinking of quality, of indicators of quality, are the competencies. And so we make the distinction between the actual design of the credential in terms of the competencies that includes to this particular category, which is the competencies that the credential holder actually possesses after they complete the credential. So that's different from what we intend for them to possess when we design the credential. This is actually what do they possess once they are finished and they have their credential. Do they have a general body of knowledge within the field of study that they should have? Do they have specialized skills? Do they have the personal skills that are required in their field and the social skills? Whatever the competencies are that was decided were important as part of that credential, do the credential holders actually have those? Can they demonstrate those? So in some ways, I think this is possibly the most important piece of the puzzle in the sense, and maybe one of the hardest pieces to measure, which is really do the credential holders have the competencies that the credential claims they do? Do we know that? So that's really the currency that we're after. And so I think that's a tricky area where there certainly needs to be more work done on coming up with good ways of assessment, ways of assessing competency. So I mentioned before at the outset of the talk that market processes are really important, but they're often not talked about. And these are really processes that, like I said, have to do with how credentials come to have value. So we want to see credentials that are well designed, that lead to credential holders that have all the competencies that were intended. But if nobody else knows those things, if there's no way to translate that into value and to make it be known among others that would use the credential may not have value. And so we need to think about the mechanisms that are at work that take what might be a high quality credential in terms of its design and the competencies of its holders, and think about how to translate that through a credential market into value. And so we've outlined a few ways a few processes where this can happen. So one of them is transparency initiatives. So mechanisms that help to provide information to consumers about the credential, and also to employers and other stakeholders. So these are really, again, sort of ways to share the information, but they are actual things that have to occur in the world. So the credential engine is one example of that, and there are many other possible mechanisms. I know some states sort of have more information available on credentials that are making public information. So I think those kinds of efforts to just make information available are important in terms of promoting transparency to help the market function better. And these really lead to greater awareness of the credential and the credential grantor. So in some cases, this happens organically, even through the market, where people or organizations that would use a credential begin to get a clearer understanding of the competencies that the credential represents, and may begin to hold positive perceptions of credential holders from their interactions with the credential holders, or they may begin to have awareness of the credential because they already have positive perceptions of the organization that's granting it. So to some extent, sort of the awareness of the credential and the credential grantor can be very important to translating its value. This leads to the next area that we've identified as important for how the market functions, which is endorsements or validations of the credential. So having an influential organization like a professional or industry association or a large employer or university recognize a credential and use it and validate it and say it's valuable. Maybe say this is a standard for employment at that organization, for example, or provide a positive review of the credential. These kinds of things can help increase the awareness of it and increase the validity of it in terms of the reputation and the understanding and the trust that the credential will mean something that's of value. So that sort of has to do with perception, but it comes from sort of the reputation that an organization can share to a credential. The state and governments sometimes have regulations, and this we certainly see with occupational licensure, where a credential is actually required. So that certainly gives it value if a state says that it's required for individuals willing to work in the occupation. But I think the thing to recognize here is that a lot of those regulations are political processes, that there's a political process that goes into play to make a particular credential required. Certainly for occupational reasons, for safety reasons, for the protection of the public, all of these things occur. But it's a political process that has to happen to make credentials required. And it's important to consider this, again, also from the equity perspective of where this is valuable and important to do. And so where this all leads us to in terms of market processes is really to looking at employer hiring practices. So is a non-degree credential listed or required as preferred or required for job postings? Do we see employers actually using non-degree credentials? And is it something that's important for advancement and for hiring? So it's really kind of looking at the use and the adoption and thinking about how to work with employers, thinking about whether there is a process to work with employers to encourage its adoption if it's a valuable credential. And then certainly educational institutions have an important role here in terms of thinking about recognition of learning. And so are non-degree credentials recognized by educational institutions and part of their PLA process? Has it been translated into credit? Is there sort of an equitable use of prior learning for non-degree credentials? And is there a fair process for students to document their learning? Is it not unduly burdensome? And are there supports to help students access the prior learning policy? So I think that these are all institutional policies that help to give non-degree credentials more value and integrate them into educational pathways where it is appropriate. So understanding what these processes are and how they function, taking a close look at them is important for understanding the quality and how this whole process works in the credential market. So at the end of the day, what do we care about? Of course, we care about outcomes for people and for society. And so I want to talk a little bit about some of those outcomes. And there's many different ways we can define outcomes. And so we offer a broad list. I think other organizations have narrowed that down a little bit. National Skills Coalition has made a very nice framework that takes a look at this for states, and others have also done this as well. We sort of outline a broad range of outcomes that can be used, and may make more or less sense depending on the particular context. So the first one is individual economic outcomes. Certainly it's important for a non-degree credential to lead to employment, either immediately upon completion, and also leading to longer-term employment. We'd want to see that the employment was in a related job, and ultimately we may want to see that the credential was related to promotion. Some non-degree credentials may be more relevant for incumbent workers who are seeking to advance. We'd also want to see a rise in median earnings immediately upon finishing the credential, and also longer term. There are many different ways that we could potentially look at earnings, and this is a whole other discussion, I suppose, but there's some other ways we could think about, a rise in earnings relative to a certain threshold, a minimum earnings threshold. Maybe we want to see people earning more than a living wage. Maybe we want to see a positive change in earnings from before or after getting the non-degree credential, or a return on investment that factors in the cost of getting the credential. And then there's also, we cannot forget, the sort of satisfaction with the employment that somebody may attain through getting a non-degree credential. So in addition to the employment outcomes, educational outcomes are also very important. We want to look at, as I've mentioned, sort of the importance of stackability here. This is really kind of assessing the outcomes for individuals. Can non-degree credential holders stack the credential? Do they progress on further in an educational pathway? Can they earn prior learning assessment credits for their non-degree credential? And can they, go on to continue and complete that credential? So making sure that non-degree credentials lead on to further education and further employment for those who seek it is very important. It's also important, I think, across the board with education, but certainly with non-degree credentials as well, to remember that there are also social outcomes that these credentials we would want to ideally look at. Positive effects on well-being and health of credential holders, other impacts like increased civic engagement, even intergenerational improvements that education has been shown to lead to, and increases in diversity and participation. So I think there are a wide range of individual outcomes that are important to look at and to determine which are most important for any particular non-degree credential when trying to assess quality. There are, in addition to individual outcomes that employers would find important. So, like I said before, there's sometimes a bit of a tension between individual goals and employer goals. Employers are probably looking to keep costs down, and workers are probably looking to get higher wages. But here, I think that certainly it's important to recognize the employer outcomes here. That non-degree credentials can help increase the pipeline for employees and improve recruitment. If the non-degree credential signals a skill that an employer wants, the non-degree credential will help with the hiring process. Also, in theory, the non-degree credential should help improve retention as we have people better matched to particular jobs. It should reduce staff turnover and reduce recruitment costs. At the end of the day, certainly non-degree credentials should help produce a higher skilled workforce that would lead to higher productivity in the workplace, better innovation, and more diversity, a more diverse pool of workers. So there's a range of employer outcomes that are important to measure and important to recognize. It's not only individuals that are getting benefits to non-degree credentials, it's also employers. And as well, it's also the society more broadly. So it's thinking about how non-degree credentials can contribute to public safety, improve efficiency for consumers, help reduce racial and ethnic inequities that have existed over time, and improve civic engagement. So there are many different things that we might look at here that are important both for employers as well as for society more broadly. So that's sort of the broad framework. I will talk a little bit about some implications for policy and practice that we've taken away from this work. So broadly, there's a need to create more awareness about non-degree credential quality and how we measure it. Definitely a need for more information. We need systems to develop and promote ways to assess non-degree credential quality and ways to promote a better use of understanding how to use non-degree credentials. We know that many states are actively thinking about quality measures and different systems that can be put in place. So we can hope we can contribute a little bit to that conversation and help advance that. So some ways to create awareness. Clearly, it's important to think about ways to integrate non-degree credentials into existing academic programs. This can improve transparency of the educational programs as well as the non-degree credentials. And conversations need to be had also about non-degree credentials with employers and think about how that might link to competency-based hiring practices. And in general, just more conversations among relevant stakeholders need to occur about non-degree credential quality. Some of this might be focused around industry sectors or occupational areas, but people need to come together and understand kind of what we're talking about and what's going on with non-degree credentials. Clearly, to help promote those conversations, we need to know a little bit more about what non-degree credentials are and what their outcomes are. And so efforts to better integrate data into systems across institutions is very important. And ways to try and engage with industry to collect data on industry certifications are certainly important. And for states, it's really important to think about how to create incentives to track non-degree credentials better and to begin to start to bring those data together across systems and linking them even to other systems that are currently, under development and around the higher ed system and connecting it to the workforce system. So we think that non-degree credentials should just be another piece of that broader puzzle that states are working on right now. Definitely, I think one of the biggest gaping holes here in this whole discussion is that there's a need for systems to assess non-degree credential quality. I mean, there are certainly some mechanisms right now that get at this from different angles. There are some states that have reporting and rating systems. We know through the WIOA, there's a eligible training provider list in some states that provide information on some of the providers and credentials that we're talking about. There's some efforts to develop consumer report cards. The Credential Registry, is a very large national initiative that is gathering information on credentials and has the potential to do some of this work. And then, clearly, educational institutions have been doing this kind of work for a long time in terms of prior learning assessment and thinking about, how do we assess learning, and certainly quality is deeply embedded in those processes. And so I think that's another very fertile area to look for systems and how to approach this. So clearly another piece of the puzzle is really figuring out how to use this data. So once we have systems and data, we need to think about how this can improve, guide improvements at educational institutions, how employers can better understand how to use non-degree credentials in hiring and promotion where it is valuable and can improve their work. And then to think about how we can guide policy discussions to make sure that non-degree credentials are used effectively and can really actively support economic and educational success. So I think we have some existing systems for assessing non-degree credential quality that are at play. I mentioned some of these. Certainly educational institutions are doing a lot of work around prior learning assessment. There's a movement towards competency-based learning. The beta credentials framework, which is again sort of outlining some of these ideas. Quality assurance commons for higher ed and post-secondary education is also doing some of this work. Like I said, there's a variety of efforts at the state level in terms of developing quality standards, the eligible training provider list. State sector strategies can also begin to engage in some of these discussions. These are very good opportunities to bring together different partners and discuss these things. The statewide longitudinal data systems is also sort of another way to promote these discussions, particularly around improving data quality. And we see the national efforts around the credential engine, and also ANSI has been in the process of creating standards for certificate programs and continuing education that offer some promise in this area as well. And then certainly there's work, on the accreditor side. There might be some opportunities there for thinking about about how to develop standards and processes that can help guide quality. So one other thing I wanted to mention is that I think this conversation all ties into some broader efforts and broader discussions around credential quality. And Lumina has been engaged in these discussions for some time, and just recently in the past year released the Credential Quality Task Force framework, which outlines individual outcomes for individuals in society, intentional design, and student-centered institutions, policies, and practices as important elements of credential quality. And you'll note that there's a fair amount of overlap and similarity between some of those ideas and some of the framework that we have to offer. So you can see from the diagrams here, we think about, they've sort of outlined a very broad system of the system here that we are imagining needs to exist for non-degree credential qualities, but there's a quality assurance system with federal, state policies, accreditation, and institutional policies that all support the idea of having intentional program design and student-centered policies and practices to help support the program design, which is very similar to what we're talking about with credential design, to eventually lead to better individual outcomes and societal outcomes for credentials. You can see also through that same framework, there's some key indicators of this, what would be this new quality assurance system. So sort of with this better sort of system of ensuring quality of credentials, you would have certain policy and practice indicators that would measure student-centered policies, that would also measure the intentional program design. So you'd have the well-designed credentials, and then that would lead us to outcomes that we see as being valuable. So with that, I think that's sort of the overview of our work. I hope that it maybe sparks some ideas and thoughts about how this can be done in various areas. I'd love to hear some questions or comments or reactions to any of this work. And also, as I mentioned, if anyone's interested in looking for more information, reading the full report, it's available on our website. There's an executive summary, and there's also a short video about 3 minutes long that sort of encapsulates some of the key ideas that are in this paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. I know I learned a lot of great things, and I do have some questions if our audience doesn't, but I have to give them the first crack at it.
Okay.
Does anyone? Okay, I do see someone with a hand up, and let me see if I can figure out how we help them with that. All right, so those of you who at MEC are helping me with these things, help me. If someone has a hand up, how do I proceed to help them ask their question? And I do appreciate all of you being patient with us as we learn this new webinar system, which has a very different interaction style. Okay, well, for the person who is just raising her hand, can you go ahead and chat and type your question into the chat box? I know at least how to make that, how to help with that. Or maybe, okay, someone else says didn't look like they did. All right. All right, well, I'll start with some questions. So you were saying, Michelle, that, okay, yep, I'm hearing from other people there are no hands up either. Okay, well then I will continue. I was interested, as you were talking about the role of accreditors, I'm assuming, so I can see there being, if these are if these are programs and credentials that are granted by a regionally accredited institution, of course, they're going to have gone through the program creation and approval process at their regional accreditor to offer some of these programs and credentials. Is there a place where, and I'm assuming in a place like Credential Engine or something, those things are noted, but I'm wondering if there are some other and like other accreditors, specialized accreditors. Again, I would love just to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, well, I guess what's interesting actually is that in terms of accreditors and their involvement in non-degree credentials, I think that certainly when we look back on that initial screen where I defined what they are, I think there is certainly the chance that they're involved in the processes around the creation of the 4-credit certificates, the ones that are less than a year but are 4-credit and academic, lead to academic credit. Where it's interesting is that they are not involved in overseeing the development of non-credit.
Oh, I guess that does make sense. Sorry, I was
right. Yeah.
Yep.
No, it's a great question. I think it's a great question because I think that's it's a really open area that is up for discussion as far as who oversees the quality there, right? What standards come into play there? What systems make sense to implement there? Is it something that the existing accreditation system needs to be engaged with? Is there a way to do that in a way that maintains the flexibility that people often like about non-degree credentials, particularly the non-credit certificates? So I think if we think about what's distinctly often offered by educational institutions, you're right that sort of the non-credit area is one place. I mean, we certainly see non-credit certificates offered by other kinds of institutions besides educational institutions, but we know a lot of colleges do a lot of that non-credit work, and that's typically not included in accreditation. Could it be? Maybe. I mean, I don't know. That's a very open discussion.
Well, right. Yeah, it's not in kind of that traditional, now that I think about like regional accreditor, but sometimes there are specialized accreditors that can,
correct.
I know they can accredit, programs that offer that 4-credit and that have degrees, but I can see them having a role, especially if one of these non-credit or non-degree bearing credentials it stacks on top of or works alongside of. I'm thinking about, for example, there's a lot of work being done right now to help teachers gain extra graduate credit so that they can teach dual enrollment courses. And those do, again, they have credit, but they're also needing to look at how those things get accredited. I mean, sometimes they're going to be going through their regional accreditor, but they're looking for other types of endorsements, like from the Department of Education or things like that. So again, I think as I'm thinking about all of these, there are a lot of places where some stamp of approval comes into play. And I'm just wondering, is there a place where those get recorded? Because again, with these being kind of different types of they're a mark of some type of accomplishment. I just don't know where that gets recorded.
Yeah, no, and I think you're right that I think there's a lot of technology companies that are kind of getting into this area. And I know Credly is one, for example. It's kind of more on the badging and micro-credential area, and there are many others. I can't go through all of them, but I think that there is this question of how do you start to mark these and make them transferable and translatable across different credentials. And I think that you're right too. The other interesting thing that I think you alluded to in your comments is the way that non-degree credentials can be combined with other kinds of existing credentials. So I think that, while many non-degree credentials can be standalone credentials, many of them can also be combined and are often combined with other credentials. So, for example, maybe you have somebody who is studying computers, right? But they want to get a specific certification in Java programming or in Cisco or something. They can get that industry certification, and they also have their undergraduate degree in IT. So that happens, right? Or you have people who, certainly occupational licensure is another example where you go through and you finish your nursing degree, but you still have to go and sit for the licensure exam. So we do definitely see this sort of overlap. Badging is another emerging area where I think we're seeing a lot of interest in that, in universities in particular, but certainly other kinds of institutions where there's consideration to say, well, how can we carve out badges that mark particular kinds of competencies that people are already picking up in their degree programs, but it's in a way it's sort of enhancing the information.
Calling that out, right?
Right, exactly. So I think that's why I said it's like the Wild West. There's a lot of different ways this is being used. And, I think it's one of the things just to figure out, how do we make sure that it's being used effectively so that we're not adding more confusion to what's already a very confused landscape around credentials.
You bet. We do have a question, and this is a good reminder. Someone has asked, can you define what you mean by PLA? Because we, how we love our acronyms in higher ed.
Right. I know, you're right. I apologize for that. I should have defined that up front. That's a definite oversight. That's a really good question. So thank you. So prior learning assessment is what I was referring to with PLA. So that's basically when educational institutions say, for a student who's come into them who has prior knowledge of a particular area, a particular field of expertise, that they can get credit for that learning. So it's also referred to as credit for prior learning. So that happens in a lot of different ways, depending on the institution. It can happen based on a challenge exam. It can happen by the student putting together a portfolio documenting what they've done. It can happen in a lot of different ways. Sometimes a non-degree credential can be a way that happens, for example. So again, with the industry certifications, if somebody has an industry certification, sometimes an educational institution will evaluate that particular certification and give equivalent credit for that to a course or to some amount of academic credit. So prior learning assessment, credit for prior learning is really a whole batch of processes that educational institutions have to recognize learning that students that the students bring with them to the institution, but it's not already marked and transcripted by another educational institution.
Right, thank you. Does anyone else have any other questions? Give you guys a few more minutes. Well, speaking again of this issue of it's not recorded anywhere else, I know I'm also beginning to look a lot at the emerging comprehensive learner records and these different ways of capturing and chronicling the experiences and the learning that an individual has accumulated. And I don't know if you are aware, you said Credly is doing some work, but I don't know, are they moving into that? We're having to move away from the traditional transcript to embrace a number of issues, not the least of which is this explosion of non-traditional credentials.
Yes, it's a great question, and now I know that some of this work has been moving. Even though people have been talking about using sort of blockchain technology to do this, to give kind of flexibility to learners to be able to take their credential kind of across different institutions and have it be accessible and validated. So I know there are a lot of different emerging companies. I'm sorry, I don't have on the top of my head all the names of the various companies that are and organizations that are out there in doing that. But I think you're right, though, that I think that's definitely a way that things are moving now, is thinking about how to be more flexible with transcripting this information, and thinking about how to make that information available and something that the students can own themselves and take as they need it to different applications and contexts. And also, I think in that process is making some of the information more specific and more transparent, what a particular credential means.
Right. Yep. And it's interesting, they're all happening at the same time. And it's difficult sometimes to know which is driving the other, or at least, they kind of take turns being in the vanguard there. So, well, I am not seeing any other questions. So I think I will go ahead and say thank you so much, Michelle. This was very, very exciting for me. And I'm glad to know that there's so much work being done on creating a framework so that we can really do our best for students as these new credentials roll out and give them some new opportunities.
Good. Well, thanks again for the opportunity to share with everyone. I'm happy to answer any other questions. If someone has a thought later and wants to reach out, my email is up there. So feel free to be in touch. Thanks again for all of this, for the opportunity to share. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. Take care.
All right.
Goodbye, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.